At first glance, it is not fire or iron that catches the eye, but paper. Neat lists of questions, columns of formulaic answers, boxes for checking admitted or did not admit, empty cells for the names of witnesses and dates of appearance. These tables contain less legend and more of the breath of the real machine. Who initiated the case? What exactly is considered bad reputation? How often people were summoned? And how much time they were given to think it over? Fear is not based on the monster, but on the schedule, and that is more frightening. I welcome you. Please write in the comments where you are watching this episode from. Which city, which country? I wish you peaceful listening. Ahead is a dry but chilling story about how the Inquisition lived, not as a myth, but as a procedure. The procedure did not begin in the basement, but on paper. The reason was public rumor, not a single complaint, but a persistent opinion that an adult was heretical, socializing, keeping texts, evading rituals, spreading teachings. This was recorded as bad reputation, and an investigation was launched. The names of those who could confirm or refute the rumors were written down. The boundaries of the community where this reputation existed were determined, and it was checked whether the initiators had any personal enmity or property disputes. In cities, announcements were posted indicating the deadlines for appearance. Within a few weeks, any adult was required to appear and say what they knew. Failure to appear meant that the person forfeited their protection of "I did not know." At the same time, a register was compiled of those who were summoned by name, with their signatures and a note of the date and place. This was followed by an interrogation about fame. It was conducted before a notary, sometimes in the presence of two witnesses, so that every detail would carry weight. The questions were formulaic. Not "do you believe," but when, where, and in whose presence was such and such behavior observed? What words were used? What items were found? How often did it happen? No literary conversation, only facts, dates written out in full, descriptions without evaluation. If a consistent pattern emerged, the case moved to the stage of a personal summons. The person was handed a summons and given time to appear on the appointed day, bring documents, name guarantors if an oath of good faith was required, and prepare answers to specific questions. If necessary, protective custody was ordered, not as a punishment, but as a way to keep the person within the jurisdiction of the court, with a record of the conditions of detention and a prohibition on harming life and health. The most important detail was the lists of questions. They were written in advance, before meeting with the accused, to rule out improvisation based on mood. The lists were divided into blocks: about the origin of rumors, about contacts with those already convicted, about objects and books, about observance of rituals, about the formula of faith, about repetition. Each block had formulas for possible answers, from "does not admit, brings witnesses," to "admits partially," and each had marked consequences: additional summoning of witnesses, search, temporary seizure of property, until a decision is made. Prohibition on movement, bail. Myth loved to tell stories about a bottomless pit into which people fell forever. The regulations showed the steps by which people were raised and lowered, not always fairly, but always according to form. The topic of interrogation with bias was also strictly controlled. It was not about endless torture, but about a one-time, formally limited intensification of interrogation, allowed only after the exhaustion of mild measures in the presence of serious circumstantial evidence and with a written order from a judge. The regulations emphasized, you cannot maim, you cannot shed blood, you cannot threaten death, you cannot repeat the intensification endlessly under the guise of continuation if there is no new information. The session is recorded, component by component, with a notary present, sometimes a doctor, noting breaks, the condition of the interrogated, all questions and answers. This is not humanism. It is the accounting of cruelty. It did not eliminate pain, but it built a wall of words around it. Who authorized it? Why? On what basis? For how long? And with what consequences for the case? These lines concealed the darkest truth. It is not the demon, but the form that makes suffering the norm. The procedure loved deadlines. After the announcement of general clemency, several weeks were given for voluntary surrender with confession and identification of accomplices, in exchange for a more lenient decision. After a personal summons, days were set aside for preparation and gathering of guarantors. Pauses were left between sessions so that the appearance of continuous torture under the guise of multiple new interrogations would disappear. At each stage there was a right of appeal. It was possible to request that the hearing be postponed due to illness, to demand the recusal of witnesses on the grounds of hostility, to refer to contradictions in testimony, to appeal to a higher judge, or to a court of another jurisdiction. It didn't look like a novel about justice. It looked like a long corridor where every door was signed in ink, and thus turned into a real wall. On the tables next to the protocols lay household papers. Confiscated books and items were listed in inventories, custodians were appointed, and sales were prohibited until the verdict. If the case involved an adult with a family, they recorded what relatives could and could not do: move property, visit, or enter into transactions on his behalf. In the case of a lenient outcome, everything was returned with a receipt. In the case of a severe outcome, items were confiscated according to the list. The economy went hand in hand with faith, which is why inquisitorial cases so often smack of warehouses and cash registers. It's not the dungeons that are scary. It's how neatly the knots are tied. By the end of the first round of interrogation, the court had a thick notebook. From the origin of the bad reputation to every detail of the interrogation regime and breaks. Based on these pages, an interim decision was made to stop, to assign penance, to continue collecting evidence, to resort to reinforcement within one session, to transfer to a secular court if the crimes were outside the jurisdiction. Myth paints an abyss, into which people fall forever. But paper teaches us to see the steps. The horror is that the steps are designed so that they can be walked long and methodically, normalizing suspicion as a way of life for the community. Further details emerged that rarely make it into legends because there is no drama there. After the initial questioning and announcements, there was a period of mercy, several weeks when adults could come forward voluntarily and reveal everything they knew in exchange for a more lenient outcome. The deadlines were written out in full, specific doors were indicated, and shifts were assigned so as not to turn the appearance into a trap. The list of questions for this period was printed in advance on parchment or copied on carbon paper, so that the words would not change depending on the judge's mood. The origin of the rumor, acquaintance with those already convicted, participation in meetings, storage of objects and books, rejection of established rituals. For each item, there was a short list of possible outcomes: assignment of penitential works, bail, temporary detention, continuation of the investigation. This fork diagram was the true face of the machine, not a black abyss, but road forks with signs posted in advance. The case was only allowed to proceed to enhanced interrogation after all lenient measures had been exhausted. Summonses, cross-examination of witnesses, searches with inventories, and checking found items against lists of prohibited items. Separate checks were made to ensure there was no personal animosity, property dispute, or tip-off from a person known to be a slanderer. The decision to intensify the interrogation was written down, stating the reasons, duration, and limits. It was forbidden to maim, shed blood, threaten death, or break up a single session into pieces under the guise of new procedures if no new information had emerged. A notary and sometimes a doctor sat nearby, noting the condition of the person being interrogated. Breaks, questions, answers, everything was recorded in writing. The cruelty did not disappear, but it ceased to be arbitrary and became an accounting of pain. This was the chilling part. Suffering was turned into an administrative operation, with a file number and the signature of the person responsible. Appeals were not a beautiful fairy tale, but a daily necessity in a long corridor. It was possible to request a postponement of the hearing due to illness, to demand the recusal of a witness as an interested party, to declare a contradiction in testimony, and to request a repeat confrontation. In some states, it was permissible to appeal to a higher judge or to the authority responsible for reviewing the form. This possibility did not make the court lenient. It made it sluggish. Every Y turned into a piece of paper passing through a new desk, a new list, a new signature. Life began to flow, not according to the will of loud words, but along the sloping plane of regulations, where speed is determined not by rightness, but by schedule. The economics of the case went hand in hand with faith, and this is evident in the warm smell of wood and wax in the inventories. Confiscated items were listed as if preparing a warehouse: 1 book, so many materials, so many yards of fabric, so many candles, a chest under seal, a key with the custodian, issuance only with permission. Until the verdict, the sale, exchange, and donation of the items were prohibited. If the outcome was lenient, the confiscated items were returned, and the owner was forced to sign for each item. If the outcome was severe, the property was classified as confiscated and distributed between the secular authorities and the church structure according to predetermined shares. Where legend seeks a secret basement, the document shows accounting. And this is what is most frightening. Suspicion becomes a form of economic activity, and someone else's life becomes a line in the cash flow plan. At the borders of jurisdictions, the machine acted as a ferry. If the case involved crimes that were not within the competence of the church, the materials were transferred to secular judges, along with extracts from the protocols. If the material concerned only the dogmatic part, the ecclesiastical court would have handed down a sentence of repentance, wearing of signs, pilgrimage, confinement in a monastery prison, and a ban on public office. Repeat offenses were considered serious. In the case of recidivism, the case could be referred to secular execution. This did not negate the involvement of paperwork at every step. Even in the case of a fatal outcome, there was a sheet number, a list of witnesses, and an inventory of property. Myth likes to say mercilessly, but reality sounds different. By the book. The form distinguished between degrees of suspicion. Serious was derived from consistent evidence and direct findings, minor from rumors and indirect connections. For light suspicion, it was possible to limit oneself to an oath, a guarantee, a penitential pilgrimage, a public vow, wearing a visible sign on one's clothing for several months or years, attending services on a schedule, and a ban on changing one's place of residence without permission. For serious cases, more severe measures were included: long-term detention, prohibition of trade, confiscation, isolation. These instruments were not acts of mercy, they were engineering. They taught the community to live under constant scrutiny, where any adult could, without malicious intent, confirm someone else's bad reputation, and thus speed up the wheels of justice. The searches were theater without an audience. They were conducted with 2 or 3 witnesses, sometimes with a priest from the local parish, so that there would be no dispute later about what was found and where. The inspection of items was turned into a textbook. Prohibited texts and fragments thereof were transcribed into the protocol, noting where the item was located and who owned it, and comparing what was found with the lists of prohibited items. In houses where nothing was found, a note was left to protect the owners from later gossip about hidden items. This paper saved them not from fear, but from a second fear, that of being caught retroactively. The protocols liked repetition, but hated infinity. This was expressed in a restriction on reinforcement. 1 session, 1 block of questions, continuation possible only with the appearance of new significant information. Breaks were noted by the hour, and in words, the condition of the interrogated person in a separate line. If the health of the interrogated person deteriorated, the session was interrupted, the reasons were recorded, and a priest or doctor was instructed to observe them. There was no humanism here. It was a form of insurance against collapse. The case should not fall apart because someone's nerves broke down somewhere. The paper protected itself. The coldest part was general mercies. The period of voluntary appearance turned not only enemies, but also neighbors, relatives, and partners in the trade into informants. In exchange for a lenient outcome, they were required to name their connections, confirm their participation, and explain exactly what happened and where. These voluntary appearances gave rise to lists of secondary summonses. No roar of a monster, only the rustle of parchment and the scratch of a pen. The mechanics of suspicion became a social habit. A person who will never see the basement will spend their whole life looking back at the bulletin board and their books, fearing that tomorrow they will find a trace in them, not because they hid anything, but because the mechanism loves traces. At the end of the long circle, the case came to an interim conclusion: termination, with a written apology to the community and a promise of correction. Repentance, in the form of wearing a sign, attending services, pilgrimages, and a ban on classes. Further investigation, with new summonses and searches. Transfer to a secular court if the case fell under the category of a secular crime. In rare cases, a decision to intensify within one session, with specified hours and prohibited methods. In legends, this is where the story ends. In documents, there is only a comma, the schedule for the next month, the names of new witnesses, a list of items under seal. The horror does not bubble up. The horror stretches out in a straight line across the office. This line also contained a conflict that people like to forget. On the one hand, there was mythologized cruelty without limits. On the other, there was a procedural machine with limits but without compassion. The line did not save people from pain, but it established order. How long the session would last, when it could be interrupted, how to appeal, how to get things back after a mild outcome, how to formalize confiscations, how to remove marks after the expiration of the term. The habit of living by this line made the community completely unfree. Freedom was not required. Predictability was required. Adults learned to say not truth and lie, but in form and out of form. This was the real without legends, not a demon, not fire, but a stamp and a table at which any fear could be turned into a schedule. After that, the corridor continued into the distance, and even drier signs appeared on the walls. Where legend seeks shadows and whispers, there lay manuals with numbered sections, collections of questions, instructions for verifying rumors, lists of acceptable practices and prohibitions. In some lands, they used manuals that offered ready-made formulas for each step: how to record bad reputation, how to write down comparisons of objects, how to draw up an oath of good faith, and how to check guarantors. The same approach was applied to the theological part. Trained assessors rewrote suspicious judgments and correlated them with prohibited formulas, trying to separate everyday carelessness from conscious teaching. In this web of terms and footnotes, heroes and villains disappeared, leaving only roles: the initiator, the notary, the keeper of the inventory, the doctor during reinforcement, the witnesses, the evaluators of words, and the judge of form. The machine survived because no role dissolved into another, and that is why it was more resilient than shouting. At the same time, there was an annual cycle of faith and mercy. In certain months, edicts were issued prohibiting certain statements and customs. Adults were offered a specified period of time to come forward voluntarily, list their transgressions, and report on their circle of acquaintances. Those who did so before the deadline received a more lenient sentence: penance, bail, marks in the parish register, a ban on holding office and wearing a badge. Those who refused or ignored the announcement faced harsh consequences: personal summonses, confrontations, searches, and intensification within a single session. Myth likes to paint an invisible funnel. Reality offered forks in the road with a signature, where each fork turned fear into a controllable habit. And it is this controllability that is more frightening than any dungeon. Contrary to later accounts, the boundaries of jurisdiction played a major role. Cases involving theological matters remained within the jurisdiction of the Church and ended with repentance, signs, prohibitions, and sometimes prolonged confinement in a monastery isolation ward. Where crimes considered secular were discovered, the materials were sent to another courtroom, with excerpts from the protocols attached. Even transfer to secular hands was not a leap into the abyss. It had a sheet number, a list of witnesses, an inventory of property, a note on the health of the accused, and a list of petitions. The horror took on a count and a chronology, and any extreme measure turned out to be the last line in a long list. Within the machine itself, there were restrictions that are rarely remembered. Endless pending cases without a decision were prohibited. It was forbidden to break up a single reinforcement session into a chain of fictitious procedures just to prolong the pain. Methods that left incurable injuries were prohibited. Death threats as a means of persuasion were prohibited. Breaks and examinations, recorded by a notary, were required. Outside these walls, the procedure counted bones and candles, but inside, it counted hours and lines. There was no sympathy in this, but there was a limit, thanks to which each subsequent step required the signature of a specific person in charge. This is where the prepared twist lies. Where you expect arbitrariness, you find a sluggish but real system of breaks. It will not protect you from pain, but it will protect you from infinity. Another twist opened up in the appeals. They did not turn life into justice, but they created moves for those who knew how to walk on paper. It was possible to request a postponement due to illness, demand the recusal of witnesses due to hostility, point out contradictions in testimony, and seek verification of inventories and correction of descriptions. In complex cities, there were advisory groups that classified phrases and objects. Theological appraisers assigned categories to judgments and thus influenced the severity of the outcome. The legend depicts a silent cry. The document shows a dispute between tables, where one table checks another, and that one checks a third. This is not mercy or humanism. It is a structure in which its own reputation is more important than a one-time victory. The economic layer continued to seep into every page. Those responsible for storing the confiscated items were appointed. Sanctions were imposed on the custodian for loss or damage. Items could not be sold until the verdict was reached. Books with markings could not be cleaned without an order. In mild cases, items were returned against receipt, counting each unit. In severe cases, the confiscated items were distributed between the secular administration and the church structure according to predetermined shares. In rare cases, the property was left to the family with restrictions if the guilt was recognized as personal and did not pose a contagious communal danger. The account, which is kept down to the last candle, makes the mechanism familiar. It becomes part of the daily routine of craftsmen and shopkeepers and turns suspicion into another form of accounting. The next area of friction is witnesses. The system did not believe in perfect memory. It loved repetition. Witnesses were summoned separately. Their statements were checked for consistency. Coincidences and discrepancies were noted, and it was recorded where each of them knew the details from, whether they were repeating what they had heard, whether they were dependent on those who had already been convicted, and whether they were in debt. If there were clear signs of hostility, the testimony could be sent to the untrustworthy folder. And if there were firm coincidences in time and place, the record was moved to the serious column. Statistics replaced eloquence. Dry table cells took the place of loud confessions in legends. And this is also part of the horror. People had to learn to speak not with the language of conscience, but with the language of verifiable circumstances. Signs of repentance worked in a special way. For minor offenses, the punishment was to wear distinctive clothing, attend services according to a schedule, make pilgrimages of certain distances, and refuse public office. The terms were specified in writing, control was exercised by the parish, and each violation resulted in a new sheet. The sign hung in the temple for years in the form of a piece of cloth with the name on it, so that the community would remember. In later retellings, this merged into a single image, but the document shows diversity. Some people went through a short period and had their marks removed, while others remained under them for many years. The machine was in no hurry. It needed life together with suspicion to become the norm. The urban environment added another cold element: network assistance. Adult lay people who were part of the court's entourage helped to summon people, monitor compliance, and report on movements and violations of the regime. Their activities were also documented: who received the assignment and when, what the result was, and what reward was due. In this way, suspicion was spread among neighbors and colleagues, and nothing deepened fear as much as the possibility of encountering the procedure right at the market. Legend sees evil intent in this. The paper simply shows how delegation brings the machine closer to the people. At the far end of the corridor lay the last mercy. If an adult, after the period of voluntary appearance, continued to deny the evidence and the items found, the court would order reinforcement within one session. The notary marked the time, the doctor noted the condition, and prohibited techniques were listed in advance. After the session, questions followed again that had to be answered, and if after the break, the person repeated the same thing, the case was returned to the Evidence Assessment Unit. Only one reinforcement was allowed per block. Further reinforcement required new data. This is the third prepared twist, where rumor awaits the abyss. There is a barrier that forces the machine to return to the tables, not to the endless night. The final stretch never looked like a climax. It was like an accounting report, either termination with a record of reconciliation and a promise of correction, or prolonged repentance under the sign, or transfer to secular judges if the case went beyond theological jurisdiction. Even when the outcome led to the most severe measure, the document compiled a grim inventory: dates, names, signatures, descriptions, distribution of property. This is where the main fork in the road between myth versus paper manifested itself. Myth tells of a monster that devours indiscriminately. Paper shows a machine that counts, fills in columns, and makes suspicion a habit. The danger is not in the demon, but in the fact that the community's memory is being restructured according to a schedule. People begin to live as if the bulletin board and the list of questions are as much a part of the landscape as the market and the well. And this turns fear into silence, and silence into order. The archive turned out to be the heart of the machine. It contained lists of seizures, notebooks with bad reputations, sheets with the results of searches, copies of decrees on strengthening and breaks, bound collections of questions with corrections in the margins. It also stored indexes with cross-references: name, occupation, neighborhood, social circle, cases where a person was a witness, custodian, or guarantor. When the legend tells of suddenness and darkness, the document shows the memory of paper that outlives people. The archive made it possible to renew old threads, return forgotten testimony, and verify handwriting and seals over the years. It was not a repository of the past, but an instrument of the future, because any new rumor automatically joined the previous lines and became part of a long biography of suspicion. This biography knew no city boundaries. Requests were sent to neighboring parishes and other courts asking them to confirm a person's role in the affairs of previous years. The letters were standard: indicate whether the adult had participated in acts of repentance, worn a sign, violated prohibitions, or had anything to do with confiscated books. In response, extracts arrived with notary signatures and seals of custodians. This is how a horizontal network was formed, in which escape to another neighborhood or another shore turned not into salvation but into a new folder with the same fields. Myth loves solitary basements. Reality loved demarcation, which built corridors of paper between cities and piers. The system also had lenient outcomes, which are rarely remembered. There were terminations with the obligation to attend services. There were periods of wearing a mark. There were pilgrimages with verifiable stops. There were bans on positions for several years. There were guarantees from craft elders. Sometimes fines were imposed, and property was returned against receipt. Sometimes they were allowed to live on the condition that the books would be kept by the parish custodian and issued on demand. This did not look like mercy. It looked like a debt contract in which the community became a creditor of loyalty. The person continued to work, but his life took the form of an installment plan, where every miscalculation drew a new line. There were also cases of punishment for false witnesses. If obvious hostility or deliberate distortion of facts was discovered, the testimony was sent to the untrustworthy folder, and the initiator received his punishment. Penance, a ban on public duties, sometimes a brief summary, sometimes a monetary penalty in favor of the victim. The machine protected not the person, but the form, and therefore punished those who spoiled the form. It was a cold balance. Lies were punished not for the sake of truth, but for the sake of the integrity of the table, so that it could be used again tomorrow. Cases involving books were handled separately. Printers, bookbinders, and booksellers lived under a schedule of inspections. Permits for printing and sale became production passports, which had to be presented on demand. Confiscations were described with warehouse-like pedantry. How many copies? What format? What paper? What bindings? Who had them? Who they were intended for? In mild cases, books were returned with distribution bans. In severe cases, they were burned according to the act, and the owner was obliged to publicly confirm that they would no longer keep such texts. This was not the flame of legend. It was the accounting of paper bodies, where each book became a unit with a destiny and a final value. Public repentance in urban environments resembled a schedule rather than a spectacle. The days when people stood in front of temples wearing signs were distributed in advance so that the community would see not a surge of emotion, but a regularity of reminders. Banners with names and dates were hung in temples. After they expired, they were taken down and transferred to separate notebooks. Some people were under the sign for several months, others for years. This long series familiarized the townspeople with the idea that suspicion is not sudden. It flows nearby, like water in a ditch. Legend tells of a monster that roars and disappears. The document teaches us to look at the wall where the names hang and at the book where the terms are written. Internal audits were another mechanism that disrupted the image of total darkness. Visitors arrived from above to observe how protocols were conducted, how reinforcements were formalized, how confiscated items were stored, how deadlines were calculated, and how appeals were heard. Following the visit, reports were written with corrections, where breaks were violated, where protocols broke down into improper chains, where the custodian allowed a loss and was obliged to reimburse the cost. This did not make the machine fair. It made it stable. The control tools existed not for the sake of people, but for the sake of the longevity of the machine itself. Border cases involving secular courts showed another level of viscosity. If theft, violence, or assault was uncovered during a theological case, the materials were transferred to the appropriate jurisdiction. But along with them went the network of connections: who was present, what was found, what the time frame was, how the seizures were documented. The secular court continued with the same routine: schedules, witnesses, inventories, distribution of property. Sometimes they would go back to clarify the form, and then the corridor would stretch out for months. There was no romance in this relationship between the church and the city. There was a habit of counting to the last candle. It was important to protect the form from spontaneity at the level of rumors. The announcement of mercy was often accompanied by the reading of a list of prohibited formulas and an explanation of how everyday carelessness differs from conscious preaching. It sounded dry and didactic, but it reduced the number of instant accusations. People learned to distinguish gossip from evidence. At the same time, this increased the obligation to remember. When the criteria are explained, forgetfulness ceases to be an excuse. The community fell into line not because it was intimidated, but because it was given a ruler that could be applied to one's neighbor and to oneself. There were cases when cases were suspended due to insufficient evidence. In such cases, apologies were made to the community, but a note was left in the archives: the date, names, nature of the rumor, measures taken, and reasons for termination. This note was not a secret stigma, but it became a point to which they returned if the rumor resurfaced. Thus, a paper shadow settled on a person, preventing them from living as freely as before the summons. In legends, evil either devours or releases. Here, evil was fulfilled as a memory that did not end with the session. The appeal process also worked to soften the marks. After the period of wearing the mark had expired, it was possible to request that the cloth be removed and the debt considered paid. The parish checked visits, witness statements, and the absence of new episodes, after which the mark was removed according to the act. It seemed like a trifle, but it was precisely such trifles that made the procedure breathable. People saw that fear had not only an entrance, but also an exit. It was cold, paid for, with time and humiliation, but it was an exit, not a wall without doors. Another layer was the internal pedagogy of the court. New clerks were taught to write using identical formulas, not to leave any living space for ambiguity, to always indicate reasons and sources, not to mix theological assessment with everyday observations, and to keep searches, interrogations, seizures, appeals, and economic accounting separate. This school of language made the machine indifferent to individuals. Some left, others came, but the phrases remained, like rails. And so the legend of the wicked inquisitor does little to explain the longevity of the mechanism. It was sustained not by personalities or flashes of jealousy, but by the ability to multiply identical sheets of paper. At the level of city life, it was not the severity of the punishments that proved most destructive, but the predictability of the procedures. People stopped thinking in terms of truth and lies and began to think in terms of form and out of form. Craftsmen stopped keeping books at home without permission, not out of fear of the basement, but out of fear of losing a week to searches and inventories. Witnesses agreed to sign not out of hatred, but out of a desire to protect themselves from suspicion of concealment. The authorities did not become closer, but they became more familiar, like a yoke that one ceases to notice. It is this gradual habituation that explains the main conclusion. The danger lay not in the demon, but in the bureaucracy, in its ability to turn fear into silence, and silence into order that can be repeated without actors and without legends. The archival machine had another layer: traveling cycles. Judges and clerks set off with portable chests, seals, a supply of parchment, and ready-made forms, announcements of mercy, summons forms, tables for questioning about bad reputation, and sample inventory lists for seizures. In small towns and parishes, it looked less like an invasion and more like a paper fair. A board with dates appeared in the square. Next to it, a table strewn with seals, rulers for straight margins, and sandboxes for drying ink. Harsh legends whisper of a sudden night. Reality put the schedule at the center of the day. Adults approached, found out if their names were there, and left with the obligation to appear in a specified number of days. The convenience was deceptive. The more efficiently the machine worked, the fewer places remained where one could avoid interacting with it. Next to the outgoing cycles lived the school of repetition. New clerks were taught not the art of persuasion, but the stubborn uniformity of wording. Every suspicion must consist of circumstances, places, time in writing, names of witnesses, and a list of items. Internal audits caught the breakdown here, where reinforcement turned into a chain of fictitious continuations, where the keeper lost the book, where the descriptions did not match, where the terms of mercy slipped away from laziness. Punishments followed the same pattern, from reprimands and bans on holding office to compensation for the cost of what was lost. The machine did not protect truth or mercy, but its own ability to open a table at the market again tomorrow and collect the same signatures again. A separate cold circuit ran through the daily routine of those who got off with a light punishment. Marks on their clothes made the memory of the case visible, and with them came restrictions on which days to stand at the temple, where to show up, which craft duties were temporarily unavailable, how far they could go from home without permission. The parish checked compliance with the deadlines and recorded each mark in a book, month after month, holiday after holiday. When the term expired, the mark was removed according to the act. And it was not like forgiveness, but like closing an installment plan. The person returned to their usual clothes, but the archive remained with cross-references. If the rumor resurfaced, all the previous sheets would be placed next to the new ones and increase the burden. Thus, constancy turned into pressure, and pressure turned into the norm. The boundaries between church and city authorities were not just for show. Within the theological part, the court imposed repentance, prohibitions, monastic confinement, and marks. Outside, it transferred materials to the secular court when the case involved theft, violence, arson, secret weapons, and other public dangers. Even during the transfer, the ink did not dry. Extracts, inventories, lists of witnesses, and appraisers' conclusions were attached to the case. The secular hand continued the music of form, the same tables, the same deadlines, the same seals on the chests of the confiscated items. Legend loves to disappear. Reality prefers bridges over which the case proceeds smoothly, as if driven by the inertia of a heavy wheel. In the field of books and paper bodies, the machine looked even more sober. Prohibited formulas and statements were written on sheets of paper, which were read aloud in certain months. Printers and bookbinders lived according to the inspection schedule. Permits for print runs became passes that had to be presented on demand. Confiscations were described in detail. Format, binding, paper, notes in the margins, who had them, and where they were found. In mild cases, the books were returned with bans on distribution and a note about storage at the parish office. In severe cases, they were destroyed according to the act, and the owner was forced to sign a promise to stay away from such texts. Horror did not seek fire as a spectacle. Horror lived in indifferent accounting, which was capable of reshaping the bookshelves of an entire neighborhood without raising its voice. The machine also considered the problem of false testimony to be its own. Revealed hostility, proven distortion of facts, repetition of mistakes by the same people. All this led to a response. A ban on public duties, acts of repentance, sometimes a brief summary, sometimes monetary compensation. The corridor did not fight for truth as a value. The corridor guarded its geometry. If its walls held, it was possible to conduct another mercy, another series of interrogations, another wave of warehouse inventories without everything falling apart. This calm endurance is what later retellings turn into total darkness. But the darkness here is a side effect of the skill of living on identical sheets. At the level of the artisan quarters, the most noticeable shift was in habits. People stopped keeping books without permission, not because they feared the dungeon, but because they feared losing a month to searches and inventories. Relatives learned to file guarantees and keep track of deadlines so that none of their own would fall into the hard zone just because they missed a day of reporting. Witnesses divided the story into facts, place, time, objects, names, and tried to avoid judgments so that they themselves would not be accused of slander. Suspicion spread not like wildfire, but like water in a ditch. Slowly, quietly, along familiar lines, turning toward warehouses, temples, bookstores, piers, and city gates. The weak points in the system did not disappear. There were clerks who grumbled and shortened formulas. There were custodians who lost things and blamed the loss on fire. There were doctors who were bribed to make the health marks look better during intensification. But on top of all this, the system was held together by repairs, inspections, duplicate books, replacing people in neighboring parishes, bans on gifts, and fines for negligence. Bad stories did not disappear. They were simply entered into another column, form violations, and life went on. There was no romance in the fight against evil. Instead, there was a simple determination not to let paper become trash. The appeal process worked both ways. It was possible to seek removal of the mark after the term. It was possible to ask for illness to be taken into account during the grace period. It was possible to point out overlapping dates that prevented attendance. The response was not regret, but new sheets, postponement of the hearing, a note about checking attendance, a decision to remove the mark from the name. These small concessions did not make the world a kinder place, but they left doors open. Expensive, slow, humiliating to the pride, but still doors. Thus the machine weaned the community off climaxes. No one waited for thunder. Everyone lived according to schedule. The extreme measure by which the past is often measured seemed devoid of mysticism in the documents. The transfer to secular hands recorded the date, place, list of evidence, and condition of the person. Property was listed in an inventory. The domestic consequences were distributed among families and communities. The participants in the case were divided into different lines of the report, some as witnesses, some as custodians, some as executors of decisions. Legend loves the moment when everything ends. Paper prefers a report that shows how long it took to get there and how many hands made it possible. The final meaning of such a corridor is not that it is scarier than a basement. It is scarier because of its familiarity. Adults learn to live by checking the bulletin board as well as the market price of salt and yarn. Craft teaches us to repeat formulas so as not to get out of shape. Archives teach us to remember not events, but schedules. And therein lies the anatomy of risk. The danger is not in the demon, but in the way of turning the community toward paper, so that paper becomes its way of life. When lists of questions and formulas for answers become more important than legends, cruelty does not disappear. The chance to see it as an exception disappears. It becomes embedded in everyday life and ceases to sound like a cry.